Welcome to class today, and this is South Carolina Social Studies Standard 8.5-3, and it talks about the end of Reconstruction. South Carolina Social Studies Standard 8.5 says summarize the successes and failures of Reconstruction in South Carolina, including the creation of political, educational, and social opportunities for African Americans, the rise of discriminatory groups, and the withdrawal of federal protection. Essential questions include what were the successes of Reconstruction in South Carolina? What were its failures? How did Reconstruction create political, educational, and social opportunities for African Americans? How were they successful? How did they fail? How did the rise of discriminatory groups affect Reconstruction efforts? How did the withdrawal of federal troops affect Reconstruction? What role did policies and actions of South Carolina's political leadership have in implementing discriminatory laws helped establish a system of racial segregation, intimidation, and violence? The new state constitution. Circumstances surrounding the writing of a new state constitution for South Carolina reflected the refusal of white society to accept the freedom of African Americans and the authority of the federal government. South Carolina refused to ratify the 14th and 15th Amendments that guaranteed equal rights and the right to vote to African American men. Consequently, under congressional Reconstruction, Southern states, including South Carolina, were required to call a convention and write a new state constitution. Most whites boycotted the election of delegates to these constitutional conventions. African Americans were the majority of the population in South Carolina, so African Americans were well represented in the convention. Slightly more than half of the delegates to the convention were African American, and half of those were newly freed slaves. Recent immigrants to South Carolina were also selected to write the document. Under the Constitution of 1868, African American men were allowed to vote and hold office, and did so in large numbers. African Americans had greater political power in South Carolina than they did in any other Southern state. Reflecting their numbers in the population, African Americans held every office in the state with the exception of the governorship, and were a majority in the state legislature throughout the Reconstruction period. South Carolina sent 6 African Americans to the United States House of Representatives. White propaganda often characterized the African Americans' elected officials as ignorant ex-slaves. Although they were inexperienced in governance, as were many whites, most African Americans who served were literate members of the middle class, many of whom have been freed before the Civil War. I want to talk a little bit about the legacy of Reconstruction. The Republican government during Reconstruction left an enduring legacy. Despite the corruption of some individuals, the Reconstruction state governments established social service programs such as state-supported institutions for the blind and the deaf, and made public health care a concern of the government in South Carolina. Most importantly, they established public schools for all children, white and African American, for the first time. However, these services also raised taxes that whites claimed were bankrupting them. Exaggerating the corruption of the inexperienced African American legislatures and playing on Northern racism, white South Carolinians effectively manipulated the Northern press with propaganda about the incompetence of the Republican government. They blamed the rising tax rate on corruption when it was largely due to new state services. Consequently, the Northern public tired of Reconstruction and gave up hope of changing Southern attitudes and ways of life. The legacy of education. The opening of educational opportunities for former slaves who had been denied the opportunity to read and write through slave codes was an enduring legacy of the Reconstruction period. Most freedmen, young and old, desperately wanted to learn. Prior to the end of slavery, some blacks had secretly established schools. After emancipation, African Americans openly flocked to freedom schools established through the Freedmen's Bureaus, schools privately supported by Northern philanthropists, and the new public schools established by Reconstruction state governments. Religious denominations and Northern philanthropists provided support for the establishment of colleges for African Americans in South Carolina, including Claflin College, Benedict College, Allen University, and the Avery Institute. The Northern Aid Society created the Penn School in Beaufort. Both men and women traveled to the South to serve as teachers. Although mocked as carpetbaggers by Southerners, these missionaries made a significant contribution to the education of African Americans. Literacy rates amongst African Americans and all Southerners rose steadily. There was also a political legacy. As a result of the expansion of democracy, many formerly disenfranchised were now able to participate in state government. However, African American gains created a backlash among white South Carolinians. Outnumbered by the African American political majority, white South Carolinians refused to participate in the new state government. I think this is a reoccurring theme throughout this period in time. Instead, they carried on a campaign of terror against African Americans and white Republicans who were perceived as assisting them. With federal troops withdrawn and the state militia disbanded after the 1868 Constitution, vigilante groups such as the KKK, the Riflemen, and the Red Shirts were free to engage in harassment, intimidation, and murder. The federal government responded by passing the Ku Klux Klan Act, and President Grant sent federal troops to South Carolina. Although some Klansmen surrendered and were brought to trial, the federal government's insufficient effort only had the effect of encouraging the insurgency. By 1876, white insurgents were ready to contest the political control of the Republicans in an election. Reconstruction ends. Reconstruction ended in South Carolina with violence and controversy. The Hamburg Massacre of 1876 took place in a predominantly African American town in Aiken County. 6 black militia members were killed by a white mob. This incident marked an intensification of the white campaign to redeem South Carolina's government. White Democratic Red Shirts, led by former Confederate General Wade Hampton, coordinated a campaign of violence, intimidation, and fraud in order to win the election of 1876. President Grant sent more federal troops, but they could not assure a free and fair election. Voting irregularities threw the governor's election into the General Assembly, but there were also disputes about who was elected to state legislature. 2 rival governments were established, one Republican and one Democratic. There was a standoff as white taxpayers refused to support the Republican government. Election irregularities also plagued the national election. The electoral votes of 3 southern states, including South Carolina, were in dispute. The resolve of Congress to protect the freedmen had waned in the face of continuing resistance of Southerners as well as the corruption of the Grant administration, economic depression in the North, and issues related to increased migration to the West. So the electoral votes are dealing with the presidential election. That's how we get our president elected. Each state has a certain number of electoral college votes. Democrats and Republicans reached a compromise whereby Democrats would recognize the election of Republican President Hayes in exchange for the withdrawal of troops from South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. The conservative Democratic partner under former Confederate General, now Governor Wade Hampton, took control of the government of South Carolina, and African Americans were left to fend for themselves in a hostile environment.